Hello and welcome to the UFC 269 edition of the Undisputed MMA show presented by the FTN Network. My name is Jonah Shiffman. I'm joined this week by my co-host, as always, John Kelly, and special guest Luke Sparring with Reality. We have a three-man booth this weekend, two title fights going down in Las Vegas on Saturday night. Obviously, we got the lightweight title between Charles Oliveira and Dustin Poirier, and then in the co-main event, we got Amanda Nunes defending her bantamweight belt for, I believe, the first time in about 2 years. But before we get to the fights, and we do have 15 of them this week, so we'll be sure to try to do the intro relatively quick here in terms of the context. John, my friend, I have not spoken to you in a week, but the people are telling me that since the last time we talked, your life changed a little bit. How are you doing, my friend? I know we're sweating out a little DK contest this weekend. Took something down earlier in the week. I assume you're doing well, but what's up, my man?
Yeah, I'm doing good, man. Fortunate enough to chop the Millie Maker on Monday night in the showdown. So obviously super excited about that. But no days off over here, man. You know it. The grind continues. We got our guy Luke coming on the show tonight. Super excited to hear your guys' thoughts about the really a banger card of a pay-per-view to close out the year here. Couple good fights up and down throughout the card. So I'm excited to hear your guys' thoughts, and we'll talk some Draftkings as well, and we'll get into it.
For sure. We'll be sure to touch on Draftkings and betting odds for all 15 cards. Before we get to the first fight of the night, Luke, my friend, you are from the Club and Sub podcast, which is obviously a bunch of friends of the show. We are excited to have you on. How are you doing before your undisputed MMA debut here on a Thursday night?
Pretty good, man. I'm looking to get back hopefully in the W column. The last 30 to 45 days or so has been a bit rough on the UFC betting front. Just been getting killed by knockouts, man. I'm not gonna lie. It's just like if I'm betting overs, if I'm betting people not to get knocked out, people are getting knocked out. So in a bit of a rough patch right now, but still it's been a pretty solid year, up I think about 71 units or so. So looking to keep it going. A lot of action on this card. For me, it's definitely a pretty fun card from a fan perspective. So looking to chop it up with you guys.
Yeah, definitely an exciting fight card from a fan perspective. I've also been on a little bit of a down streak recently, but if anyone can turn our luck around, hopefully it'll be John coming off of the big win. Without further ado, let's move on here to the first fight of 15 going down on Saturday night. We got Jillian Robertson currently priced as a minus 410 favorite here, one of the biggest favorites on this week's fight card. She's $9.3 thousand on DraftKings as she takes on Priscilla Cachoeira, who comes back plus 300, plus 310 underdog just about everywhere in the market currently, and she's $6.9 thousand on DK. John, I'm pretty sure you have a bet on this fight. I'll let you go first and kick things off in our first fight of the night.
Yeah, I wanted to play either an under 2.5, but FanDuel sometimes is late to release those. I played the fight doesn't start round 3 at, I believe, minus 138. I'll have to double check that, but I'm pretty sure it was minus 138. This is a spot where I honestly think Jillian Robertson rolls here. Like Priscilla Cachoeira, shout out to her, no disrespect, because she cashed a knockout prop against Gina Mazzani, which was like legendary because she was like, that did not look pretty the first couple rounds. And then she comes back from the depths of hell and cashes the knockout prop. So that was awesome. But you know, the story with her is she's a heavy hitter, but she can't defend the takedowns. She can't grapple whatsoever. I think Jillian gets her down with little resistance here. And you know as well as I do, when Jillian Robertson gets on top, she's a serious problem in this division. She's always looking to finish, whether it's, you know, ground and pound or hunting for submissions. I think she gets it done here inside the distance. I did play the fight doesn't start round 3, though, just in the event that maybe Cachoeira catches her early. You know, we've seen her get knocked out before. If she struggles to get the fight to the ground, then she kind of, you know, panics because she doesn't have much striking in the striking department. So I played fight doesn't start round 3. I feel pretty good about it, but Robertson's definitely my preferred side on DraftKings. I think she scores pretty well here.
Yeah, I agree with the majority of your takes here. Luke, this is the first time that Jillian Robertson has dropped back-to-back fights in her pro career. Regardless of that, the market seems to be showing her a lot of respect. I know she opened about minus 250 2 weeks ago when the market opened, steamed up to minus 400 now. Any action for you in this fight, or you think that the line is pretty accurate where it currently stands?
Yeah, I actually had Robertson in a parlay with Brennan Allen from last week, which obviously crashed and burned a la Chris Curtis. So No action for me technically on the fight. But to a lot of John's points, I think it's a pretty decent style matchup for her. I think roughly, 70% of her fight time in the UFC is spent in the grappling. And of that 70%, she's in control positions about 68% of the time. I don't think she's like the best pure wrestler per se, but she's a decent one for the level. She's got an elite level top game. And just what we've seen from Cachoeira on bottom, it hasn't been pretty. She only stuffs takedowns at 41%. We saw Chev beat her up on bottom. It's Chev's, give her a bit of a pass there, 100%. But, we still saw Molly McCann take her down a couple times, get to her back, and a girl in Gina Mazzani take her down 4 times as well, and really not have much issue getting the fight to the floor. So I don't see why Robertson can't get this fight to the mat. I have heard some, merit to flyers on Cachoeira based on the stand-up component, because, I can't concede the fact that, Robertson doesn't really react to general pressure very well. I get that Cachoeira is going to throw heat, but it's one of those situations where I just don't see this fight taking place at space for very often. And when Jillian gets this fight down, the levels on the ground here are just gigantic. So I think she's incredibly live for a submission or a ground and pound type of finish. I'm more so leaning the submission just because she hasn't been the, most over ground and pound type of girl. She's looking to take necks. And I think that's what happens here. It's just kind of one of those spots where when Jillian's supposed to win her fights, she's winning her fights. When she's not, that's the other case. I just think it's a great style matchup for her. Am I really willing to lay, minus 400 with it? Probably not. But I think I don't hate your plays on the fight doesn't start round 3. I'm personally looking to Jillian inside the distance, kind of around that evens mark, just because I think that window for Cachoeira is going to be reasonably small.
Yeah, I won't add too much in terms of the analysis here. I think you guys pretty much nailed it. Pretty binary fight. If it stays on the feet, I would have to favor Cachoeira, obviously, although I don't think it spends much time on the feet. Luke, you mentioned, Jillian is not the best wrestler in the world. I don't know if she'll need, A-level wrestling here. And I do think she's pretty close to an A-level kind of submission artist grappler in general, especially when she's in top control. We've kind of seen her out-muscled a little bit and land on bottom and pull guard, stuff like that before. I don't think that'll be an issue in this fight. I played the under 2.5 rounds at minus 150. So similar thinking to John on that play. And then also, if you guys have Draftkings, they've been opening a lot of prop markets. Shout out to Draftkings since they switched kind of odds providers away from the Canby technology. They've opened a lot of markets themselves, and they have the decision only market. So if the fight finishes, then your bet pushes. I actually laid minus 250 for a pretty good amount here with Jillian Robertson in that market. I just think that the chances that Cachoeira wins a decision are, I would say, slim to none. I think she has a chance to win the fight, but it's going to be overwhelming. An overwhelming majority of her win condition comes via knockout, right? Like if she catches Jillian Robertson at space, I think it's really kind of improbable that Cachoeira is going to get to a point where she's able to win 2 rounds here and not find a finish at some point. So laid it pretty big with Jillian in that market. Hopefully the under comes through and that bet pushes and we all win a little bit here on Jillian inside the distance. But I think pretty consensus thinking here in our first fight of the night. Let's move on to Randy Costa versus Tony Kelly. Tony Kelly, which is a pretty good fight. We got 15 fights this weekend. The second fight of the night, I would say, is one of the ones I'm most looking forward to in terms of just watching as a fan. We got Randy Costa coming off of a competitive fight against Adrian Muniz where he was eventually knocked out, but looked pretty solid up until that point. He's a minus 170 favorite, $9,000 flat on DraftKings. Tony Kelly comes back as an underdog in this spot. He's plus 150, $7,200 on DK, coming off of his first UFC win last year about this time. So it's been a long layoff for Tony Kelly. Underdog this weekend against Randy Costa. Luke, any action for you here in the second fight of the evening?
Yeah, I actually played Kelly at plus 170 here. It's just one of those classic spots from a general betting perspective when we have a guy in Randy Costa who's never really won a fight, I think, past the 2 or 3 minute mark in his entire pro career, when he's fighting a really tough, battle-tested guy in Kelly who's been around forever, never been finished in his pro career. Not great defensively, but as touched on, pretty durable. He's a guy who's going to throw a lot of strikes. He is a purple belt in jiu-jitsu, a decent grappler. Traditionally how Tony Kelly is dropping minutes in his fights is because of wrestling, the guys like, El Casey and Kai Kamaka, who are better wrestlers, but that's not the archetype of Randy Costa. So obviously there's definitely some sweaty, hairy moments here early. I think Costa obviously is live for a KO, but when you got like a minus 200 number, next to a guy who has never shown that he can win any sort of extended minutes over anybody in his entire pro career, let alone at a UFC level, that automatically is going to kind of start spinning the wheels in my head from a betting perspective. And I don't think Tony Kelly does anything great per se, but I'd classify him as just a serviceable fighter. As touched on, he's durable. He's going to throw a lot of strikes. He's a decent submission grappler at the same time. I just have so many questions on Randy Costa in an extended fight. Whereas if Randy Costa does not knock out Tony Kelly in the first round and meet that primary win condition, okay, what then? We're kind of in a bit of no man's land. So give me plus 170 on that. I'm kind of willing to play into the variance to get more questions answered on Costa, because the fights that have been extended for him, it has not been pretty. You know, we saw Brandon Davis go out there, stuff one of his takedowns, get to his back, choke him out with no hooks in after he gassed in the second round. He blew his wad against Yanez. He goes out there and gets finished. So I just think there's a ton of merit to why you can say and make a solid value-based case on Tony Kelly in this spot. So I was willing to lay it.
Yeah, you know, for me, I think it's clear to me why Randy Costa is favored in this matchup. You just look at round one against Adrian Yanez, like the tools are clearly there for this kid to win a lot of fights at the UFC level. It just kind of comes down to this cardio dynamic where if he's not getting guys out of there in the first round, Luke, you mentioned like the collapses in the fight against Brandon Davis specifically in round two. And that was what, 2 years ago at this point, and he still looks like he hasn't corrected those mistakes in his game, comes out super hot and then seemingly slows down, like even at the 5-minute mark, right? Like it's not even taking to the 7-minute mark. Even at the end of round one against Yanez, it kind of felt like the tides were beginning to turn a little bit despite his hot start. So I understand Costa being a favorite just kind of based on his raw talent level and upside. I'm not going to bet him at this price. I think Tony Kelly has some merit as an underdog. Luke, I think you laid out a pretty good case to play him. No action for me currently. A little bit tempted by the under. Just like I think a lot of Costa's win condition is always going to come via first round knockout. And if he doesn't get it, we've seen him collapse and get finished twice in the 2 fights that he's lost in the UFC. I just don't know if Tony Kelly is going to be the guy to really go take initiative and go out and hunt to finish late in the second or third round. I think he might be a guy that's just content to win a decision at that point. And you're getting like a minus 170 price about for under 2.5 rounds. So pass for me in this fight. On the money line, I understand the Kelly love a little bit. John, anything for you here?
No, I didn't bet anything. I totally understand the play on Tony Kelly. Plus 170 is a great number too. It's at plus 150 now. So a little bit of CLV for you. I know CLV has been like a death curse lately. At least for me, it has, but hopefully it doesn't do that for you. But I mean, this is like, I agree with everything you guys said. This is a super easy fight to break down because every Randy Costa fight is the same way. It's like, he's liable to kill you in round one. Outside of that, he is liable to be finished in round 2 or round 3 if it makes it that far. And Tony Kelly, like, he's got legitimate skills. Like, I don't think he's a bad fighter. The concern I have with Kelly is he probably does die here in round 1, at least, you know, a decent amount of time, just because, you know, I do favor Costa's striking. He's a much better boxer, much more powerful. And Kelly's a guy who we know keeps his hands low, doesn't really move his head, eats a lot of clean shots. If he eats clean shots from Randy Costa here, he might be the first one to put him out. But like you said, I mean, outside of a round 1 knockout, he's super, super live as we get into rounds 2 and rounds 3. Much better cardio, never been finished, grappling upside if he can get it to the mat. So yeah, I mean, I totally get the underdog shot. I'm just going to hedge it on DraftKings. I understand the upside of Costa in round 1, but Kelly's definitely a live underdog this week. But we have a lot of live underdogs that I think we'll get to moving on. But yeah, no action for me, just going to play both sides on DraftKings.
Yeah, in terms of the DraftKings market, for me, I actually prefer the Kelly side. I'll side with Luke here. I think that at the 9K price point for Randy Costa, it's just there's so many questions. And yeah, he does have a high ceiling, but so does pretty much everyone in that price range this weekend. And I feel like it's a spot where if you're paying up over 9K, I want someone who I have a little bit more confidence in, A, their upside and hitting that win condition, and B, just winning the fight in general. So I think Kelly makes for a decent underdog to play at $7,200 on DraftKings this week. We can move on now to our third matchup, which is a really interesting one, I think, to break down from a stylistic perspective. We got Ryan Hall currently lined as a minus 200 favorite. He's $8,900 on DraftKings against Derek Minner, who comes back a plus 170 dog, $7,300 on DraftKings. I'll go first in this fight just because I don't have a bet and I don't think I'll take too long here. It's an interesting matchup. I've seen a lot of people kind of coming down on the Derek Minner side this weekend. I think there's some merit in the fact that he has a stand-up advantage in this fight which we don't always see with him. And he's also a competent grappler in his own right. But I tend to side more so with Ryan Hall here as a minus 200 favorite. I'm not sure I'm going to lay that type of number with Ryan Hall. But to me, Ryan Hall is a guy who you're going to want to fade with someone who has a skill set that kind of is perfectly the opposite of him, right? Like you want a guy who, first of all, Ryan Hall doesn't have great wrestling in order to get into jiu-jitsu, which is obviously his main way of winning fights. But to me, I'd prefer to fade guys against Ryan Hall who have solid submission defense or not going to jump into his guard and are just going to kind of stay at range and be able to outbox him on the feet, potentially put heavy shots on him. We saw Topuria obviously pick and choose his shots pretty well and end up knocking out Ryan Hall. And for me, with Derek Minner, it's just one of those things where I think Minner's a decent fighter. I think he has more power in this matchup, has a chance to win by knockout. He's just so likely to try and grapple with Ryan Hall. We have a massive sample of Derek Minner fights, and in every single one, he looks to grapple. And I just think there's levels to jiu-jitsu. He's at a pretty big disadvantage here. I think Ryan Hall is pretty likely to submit him if they do end up rolling at some point. And that's my pick for the fight. I think Hall wins via submission, but no bet for me here. Luke, anything for you in the Ryan Hall versus Derek Minner matchup?
Yeah, it's a pass, man. These Ryan Hall fights are incredibly difficult to assign a number to just because there is, not a lot of benchmarks, historically, even in the UFC, regardless of weight class to a Ryan Hall. But what I will say, to your point, there's been a lot of Minner love. My club and some boys, I think a lot of them are on Minner as well. It's not for me. I mean, I'm not necessarily running the window to lay minus 200 on Ryan Hall, just given his style as well. But I think his style is also very important to note, where is I think a lot of people assume that Derek Minner has advantages on the feet here. And I'm not 100% convinced about that, because even before the Topuria fight, I mean, the dude only ate, I think, 0.75 strikes absorbed per minute, which was a crazy low percentage. He's just a guy who fights in a weird way, fights from the outside. He's going to throw a lot of range-findy kicks. He just avoids the fight in a lot of ways, which makes it difficult for obviously guys to get off on him. Minner will come forward and throw heat, but he's not really technical in anything he does to make me suggest that I think he can just go out there and just beat the shit, out of Ryan Hall on the feet. Not to mention, even when he fought Topuria obviously, had some success. But if you actually go back and look at the distance numbers there, Topuria only landed like 5 distance strikes on him. Primarily, the shots were coming actually in the guard. And obviously, that's how he finished him. But it wasn't at distance. So we've seen a lot of guys struggle with that really range-findy game of Hall, because usually when people when guys come in on him, dude's just going to drop down. He's going to pull guard. So, he's not a guy who's going out there and getting paced or beat up on the feet. It almost never happens. And how that translates to just the general style of Derek Minner. He's your kitchen sink jiu-jitsu guy. He's going to go down. He's going to try to put you in some tricky spots. He's put some pretty actually good guys in tricky spots, I should say, in the past as well. But Ryan Hall is a very unique character where I don't think that type of kitchen sink jiu-jitsu archetype is going to beat a submission specialist in Ryan Hall. I've heard some people reference, the Charles Rosa fight. Okay, he fought smart there. It's like, okay, but we also have about 39 other fights to suggest that is not how Derek Minner fights. So I tend to lean on the 95% of the side of where Derek Minner is going to open up and make small mistakes, and you cannot make mistakes against a guy like Ryan Hall, who is obviously a very high level grappler, ADCC type of guy. He will grab your leg. He will grab your neck. I think the general style of Ryan Hall is actually going to frustrate a Derek Minner and make him make those small mistakes. So I like Ryan Hall to snag up a sub at some point along the way. I kind of think Minner bets are traps.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I actually really like that you brought up the fact that Ryan Hall does a good job mitigating strikes against him on the feet. I think that's something that him and Jillian Robertson kind of share in common here as grapplers, who are usually outgunned on the feet, but do a really good job at kind of dictating where the fight goes. Even if the wrestling isn't great, they kind of avoid getting stuck at range with opponents who are going to outpace them on the feet. John, anything for you here? I know Ryan Hall is your guy. Anything for you? Minus 200, I think, is a little bit much in terms of the price to lay, but I assume you're picking him this weekend and still riding with your guy, Ryan Hall, this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of disappointed for 2 reasons. One, I thought at least one of you would be on the Minner side, and I thought maybe we could have a little bit of back and forth, which would have been nice. But number 2 is that you guys hit on all the main points. Ryan Hall, I say it all the time, like, the dude is so underrated because of how dangerous he is in the grappling, but also, like, people don't want to get too close. So then they get stuck at range. Like, he's very good with that distance management. Like Luke was saying, like, he's got good kicks. We've seen the striking improve over his last few fights. Like, he's not a bad striker. So like, people thinking that, well, Minner could just not grapple and win a striking decision here, or just knock Ryan Hall out because Topuria knocked him out. Like, I think that's people trying to make it much easier than it actually is. We've seen time and time again, people try to employ that game plan against Ryan Hall, and it just doesn't work because he's so difficult to deal with. And then on top of that, you have to factor in, like, Minner aggressively grapples in every single one of his fights. Like Luke said, like, he has like 30 fights. He's grappled in every single one of them. And most of the time it's really early in the fight. So now I know he has James Krause now. So you got to factor in, he's probably coming in with a good game plan, but it's like, even if you believe he fights the right game plan, which I don't believe that, but if you believe that, I still don't even think he's a lock to win a striking decision against Ryan Hall. Like, I would prefer goes to decision rather than Minner money line, because it's almost the same number. I think Bet Online had like a plus 175 earlier today, but even FanDuel had like plus 150. I think goes to decision covers more outcomes because it covers a smart Minner striking based decision. It covers a weird Ryan Hall striking based decision. It covers Derek Minner top position, top clinic without getting subbed. Like, I just feel like that is a much better way to go about the fight rather than just betting on a guy who's been historically known as round one or bust. And we know he's going to look to grapple against a guy who's much more dangerous in the grappling realm. So yeah, it's not a bet for me because, like you said, Ryan Hall is just so hard to actually price accurately in the market, because it's like, he might just sub Minner in round one here. And so then it's like, okay, I guess he covered minus 200. But on the flip side, it's like, I wouldn't feel comfortable laying minus 200 like against a lot of people, including Derek Minner. So it's a difficult fight to cap. But I do think Ryan Hall gets the job done. I'm just kind of toying with the idea of how to kind of attack it on DraftKings, because we know both guys can win by finish early. I think it comes from the Hall side significantly more here, but also, like, if they get stuck in that weird striking low output decision, neither guy is going to score well at all. So it's like kind of a fight where I want to have enough of it so that it doesn't kill me, but I also don't want to go overboard because I know the floor is pretty low here in a Ryan Hall fight.
Yeah, I agree with all those points. I think it sounds like we're all passing, but I like the breakdown here of that fight. Let's move on to the flyweight division. This is a pretty good fight that I think is kind of going overlooked on the card. We got Alex Prez, currently priced as a minus 335 favorite, just about $9,200 on DraftKings. He takes on Matt Schnell this weekend, who comes back plus 260 as our dog. He's $7,000 flat on DraftKings. I'll go first here. I have no bet on the fight, but I do think it's an interesting matchup. You know, a buddy of ours, K1, said to me earlier this weekend in Discord, we have like the most wrestleable man in at the flyweight division, which would be Matt Schnell. He's got like a 50% takedown defense against the most guillotine chokeable guy, and Alex Prez. You know, Alex Prez has 6 career losses. I think 3 of them have come via guillotine choke. We saw that obviously in the Davison Figueiredo fight for the title his last time out. You know, in my opinion, I think that Alex Prez is honestly maybe the most talented guy at 125 pounds, just skill for skill. The problem is that he puts himself in these bad positions where he gets submitted. He's a little bit fragile. We've seen that in the past, but I think in terms of his pure skills, his wrestling, he's one of the most talented guys at the weight class. And on the other hand, we got Matt Schnell, who's kind of had a little bit of similar issues in terms of the durability. We've seen him knocked out a few times. We've seen him put in a couple bad positions on the mat, but Matt Schnell's a guy who he gets in volatile fights, right? Like, he's a guy who he has a 50% takedown defense because oftentimes he's happy to flop to his back and play guard. He's a pretty solid triangle choke. I'm not a guy who ever likes to back fighters and see them off their back trying to get submissions, but Matt Schnell is someone who, historically speaking, is willing to go out there and throw up triangles, throw up stuff off his back. And that's been a place where Alex Perez has kind of struggled a little bit in the past. However, I got to lean with Alex Perez here, minus 300. I'm not betting it, but I do think it makes sense to have him as a 75%, 80% favorite here. I think he's a much better striker. His light kicks should be there. We've seen him win a fight via knockout via light kicks recently, and I think the wrestling takedowns will be there all day as long as he kind of stays safe from top position. So no bet for me here, but I think Perez makes a lot of sense as a favorite. John, I'm about to toss it to you here, but one thing I want you to include in your breakdown, if possible, is kind of what are you doing here with Alex Perez on DraftKings? Because he's a big favorite. He's $9,200 on DraftKings. We've seen him have finishing upside in the past. We know he has wrestling upside. And yet we have these fighters like Amanda Nunes on the slate who are so much higher in terms of the projections to finish inside the distance that I think pretty much no one is going to play Prez on DraftKings. Is this a spot where you're getting contrarian and playing a little bit of Prez at 9.2K, or you're just kind of going with the higher projected fighters like a Nunes or Bruno Silva elsewhere on the card?
Yeah, I mean, we'll get to Nunes later. I definitely think she's one of the safest plays on the card, but I do like Perez quite a bit. To answer your question, he is affordable. He's not quite up in that top range. And I do think, he does have finishing upside, but I like to target the fighters who, even if they don't finish, I see a path to them scoring well. And I think Perez fits that mold here. I think he can land takedowns here fairly easily. I don't know if he wants to land takedowns here because I think he's probably the better striker. And Schnell is a guy who we know his durability is not great if this does turn into a striking match. The thing with Perez is like he has Schnell covered pretty much everywhere. He should win here. The only concern is that the guy just repeatedly sticks his neck out there when he's going for takedowns. And we saw it most recently with the Davison Figueiredo fight. But outside of that, I mean, and honestly, I'd be surprised if Schnell catches him with something like that. But outside of that, I think Perez gets a job here. I think he's a solid play on DraftKings. I wouldn't say he's like a core play for me because, like you said, 15 fights, and there are a lot of fighters that I really like, even in the expensive range. So I'm kind of just gonna go balanced up top, but he's definitely in the mix for me. I like him quite a bit.
Yeah, Luke, we'll toss it to you here. Not much line movement kind of from anybody here. There's been pretty much no action on the money line. We've seen Perez kind of stay still as a minus 300 favorite for the majority of fight week. The total has stayed kind of the same, about minus 140 to go over 2.5 rounds. Any action for you in Perez versus Schnell, or you think the market is pretty accurate at this point?
Yeah, I think the market is pretty accurate, and I think that's probably why we haven't seen a ton of movement. I think, him around that 75% range is about accurate. Schnell's always been an interesting case study to me because I think he's actually a better fighter than kind of how his overall trajectory has came, even though I know he's had just in general more overall success in terms of his general record. I think he's a pretty technical boxer. He's pretty fast. But the problem is the fight IQ you guys kind of touched on isn't there. He's gotten into these pocket-based brawls when he just can't. That's not his game. His chin, his durability is not held up in those type of scenarios. But then we've also seen, when he's actually fought smarter, it hasn't always looked good for him at the same time. He went and fought Tyson Nam in what was a relatively lower volume output-based match, one in which I thought he won. But nonetheless, fight was still, scored a split just based on the general style dynamic there, which, I mean, you shouldn't be going to a split, with Tyson Nam. You should have been able to clearly outpace him and at least make it more definitive in terms of the eyes of the judges. And then he went and fought Rogerio Bontorin, who's not a great striker by any means. And he just kind of, I wouldn't say looked lost in there, but he was just a step behind that entire fight, where I would actually still say that I think Schnell is a better technical boxer than Bontorin, but it didn't matter in that spot. So how it translates to Perez is a guy who's going to go forward. He's going to chuck a lot of heat. He's got those really nasty leg kicks. And I think that's something that needs to be noted against a guy in Schnell, who's a very, forward pressure. I shouldn't say forward pressure, but kind of more mid-range based boxer is going to stand really heavy on that lead leg. I think there's kicking based success here for Perez. I think he's the guy who's more consistent to go forward, land volume, land the bigger shots. You guys kind of touched on the grappling. There's definitely some considerations with him in terms of his general submission defense. He will kind of stick his head into those guillotines. Schnell is a guy who will kind of attack those, but I still think that outcome for Schnell is lower percentage. And I do think Perez actually does have the wrestling game coming from that collegiate wrestling background as well, to control a guy like Schnell on the mat who will accept those type of takedowns. And honestly, maybe a hot take here from me, I can see Perez actually subbing Schnell, to be honest. I think his general pressure, whether that's on the feet or on the ground, that he's going to push in this fight is actually going to tire Matt Schnell to make some small mistakes. And he's a competent submission grappler. And I think, Jonah, you kind of hit it on it too. Like, I think this kid is probably one of the best guys at 125. I think there just might be a little a little bit of, I shouldn't say recency bias, because obviously, he's a really massive favorite here on the general line. But I think people forget, how good and how well-rounded this kid is. And I just don't, Matt Schnell falls into the category of guy who is never going to live up to what his overall potential is, in my opinion, unfortunately. Am I trying to lay, minus 300 on it? Probably not. I think the under 2.5 could be a sneaky look at plus money, though. I guess that's how I'd go about it if I was to do anything.
Yeah, that makes sense. Definitely looking forward to that fight. I do think that we're all kind of all in agreement here that Alex Prez gets back on track this weekend, gets back in the win column over Matt Schnell. Let's move on to our next fight, which features, two pretty strong prospects here in the women's division. We got a fight between Erin Blanchfield, who is coming off of a win in her UFC debut. She's currently the underdog at plus 115 against Miranda Maverick, who's the minus 135 favorite here. Maverick is $8,400 on DraftKings. She's technically coming off of the loss to Macy Barber. I think if you asked most people on the three of us on this show or people in the chat on YouTube, shout out to the people watching live, I think the majority of them would have scored that fight for Miranda Maverick. Obviously, it goes down as an L on her record, but she's a small favorite this weekend against Erin Blanchfield, who shout out to our guy Martian MMA, a big fan of Erin Blanchfield. And John, she's repping. Is she repping PA or is she from New Jersey? She's definitely.
I think she's New Jersey. Yeah, East Coast for sure, but I think she's a Jersey girl.
All right, well, we'll say she's repping the East Coast. She doesn't get the repping PA treatment from John, but
we don't claim Jersey. PA, we don't claim Jersey.
I'll tell you what, New York doesn't claim Jersey either. I'll throw that out there, but let's keep it on the fight here. Any action for you here? Miranda Maverick versus Erin Blanchfield, John.
No, I think this is a close fight. I get the underdog shot on Erin Blanchfield, but I just think she struggles in terms of the physicality. Like Miranda Maverick, and I don't know what you're talking about. I thought Macy Barber clearly won the fight. I'm being sarcastic because I bet Macy Barber there, and that was like the luckiest cash I've ever had in my entire life. I thought Maverick clearly won the fight, but yeah, I mean, I just think Blanchfield, I don't know if she's going to be able to kind of outmuscle Miranda Maverick. And I know Maverick's shown at times she has holes in the grappling, whatever, but I just think she's a lot stronger. I think she's a better striker. I think both of them can kind of have success in the striking though. Like, I think both are pretty hittable. I think Maverick's probably a better striker, but it's really just all around, like every part of this matchup. I just see the fight playing out super competitively. I think the margins are pretty thin here. Like I said, I understand the dog shot on Blanchfield. If you think it's a 50-50 fight, take the plus money, whatever. But I lean Maverick here ever so slightly. I think Maverick wins the decision.
I'm in a similar boat here. I just think that Maverick is a little bit stronger. I favor her in the stand-up over Erin Blanchfield. I think the grappling will be competitive. Luke, do you have any thoughts on kind of how the grappling will play out in this fight? I know in the Jillian Robertson fight, we saw Miranda Maverick kind of reversed on the mat, I wouldn't say in trouble, but certainly showed some vulnerability in her grappling. And I tend to think that Erin Blanchfield is the better grappler in this fight, but I think it's close. Any opinion here for you in Blanchfield versus Maverick?
Man, I've kind of went back and forth on this one. Ironically, I've been a big Blanchfield truther as a longtime Invicta viewer. I'm one of them weird motherfuckers who's out here been watching Invicta for years. So I have watched Erin Blanchfield's career probably 4 to 5 times over. I'm very familiar with the girl she's fought, and I think that's an interesting component of this matchup is that Erin Blanchfield has fought almost exclusively grapplers in terms of her entire career. I'm not overtly bullish on the striking of Miranda Maverick, but I think it's gotten better, and I do think she's the better one here. I know a lot of people, look at the last fight for Blanchfield. She beat the shit out of poor Alpar, but unfortunately, Mrs. Alpar is not a good striker and a complete punching bag. So I don't think there's a ton of context there. So I do think Miranda Maverick is the best striker that Blanchfield's fought to date. You brought up the physicality advantages. I think that's kind of my main talking point for this fight and why I slightly lean Maverick, because I do think she has physicality advantage. But you also brought up a good point, in terms of the Robertson fight where, she did in terms of Maverick, she did drop that second round to Jillian via grappling. She has struggled in terms of the defensive wrestling at points throughout her career, more so earlier in Invicta, even though I think it's something in her game she's somewhat evolved. However, I do think Blanchfield is the better submission grappler. She did just get her black belt, I think roughly 6 months ago or so. She's got a pretty strong top game. She's a talented girl. I mean, in general, you just don't see too many girls or fighters in general who got their black belts at 21 years old. She's won, Eddie Bravo shit. She's won IBJJF stuff. I think she is the better grappler in this fight, but when it comes to WMA, physicality is a real thing. So I do think there's potentially some merit to, Maverick kind of being that wet blanket and kind of bullying her that way. But I do think Blanchfield is the better grappler in this fight. And I do think she can put Maverick in some tricky spots. So I'd lean Maverick, but it's not a strong take at all. I think you can really make a strong value-based case to either girl, depending on how you perceive the matchup.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I'm not a professional fighter, but I'm also nowhere near my black belt at age 21. This is a good matchup, though. I'm excited to watch it go down. I think these are two kind of my favorite fighters in this women's division at this time. It's kind of weird they matched them up. Like, I kind of wish that we would see this fight down the line. Like, it's kind of tilting to me that we're seeing this fight when Blanchfield's like 21, 22 years old and Maverick's like, what, 24? I feel like
I don't get it, dude. I don't get it, dude.
Yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt you, Jonah, but I hate when they do this shit. I hate when they put these two talented prospects together. I just don't get it from like a long-term thinking perspective. It doesn't make sense to me.
I mean, I like the matchup, but like Jonah said, like I like when they face two prospects together, but once they're like established and both like, fighting for rankings, etc., like on the verge of being ranked, like this is Blanchfield's second fight in the UFC. Like this is too soon for somebody that, you would think the UFC would want to get behind. So that's where it's like kind of a head scratcher for me.
Yeah, like from a general marketing build perspective, you're just not doing either girl any favor, regardless of who wins. In my opinion, I don't think you're doing any, because obviously we saw with the outcome of Maverick and Barber. Obviously, I was actually on Barber as well there, and got a bit of a gift. I'll own up to that, but I don't understand the long term UFC thinking with the matchup.
Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between this type of matchup and then like Ilya Topuria versus like Movsar Evloev. Like that's a matchup between two prospects who've gotten wins in the UFC. They're close to fighting in the top 10 of a stacked weight division. This is a weight division pretty barren, 22, 21 years old. It's like the second fight for Blanchfield in the UFC. But we do have like 10 more fights to break down. So we'll keep it rolling here on the Undisputed Show. Next up, we got Andre Muniz. He's a minus 145 favorite coming off of what I think I would call a surprising submission victory over Jacare Souza. In his last time out, he's $8,500 on DK. He takes on Eric Anders, I should say. You boys plus 125, $7,700 on DraftKings this weekend in a fight that certainly seen a little bit of action in the betting market. We've seen that Anders number come in a little bit throughout the week, but not too much action to the point where it's anything super noteworthy. John, I know you have a bet in this fight, so I'll let you go first. I know you like a side on the money line here.
Yeah, I'm on the Anders side for 2 units. Played him at I think plus one. I'll have to check because I don't want to give off a bad number. I know it's plus 115 now. I think I played it plus 125, but not positive. But I do like the Anders side. Muniz, super dangerous grappler. Like that's what he is, a submission specialist. But outside of that, like I have a ton of concerns with this dude. Like, and I think Anders is probably well-rounded enough, to stay safe early on. And I think he's a much better striker. If he can just avoid the grappling. But even like this is a little bit different than the Minner Hall because I think Anders is more athletic. Neither guy's cardio is great in this matchup, but Anders is much more athletic. But Anders is also like he's much more physical. He's not a terrible grappler himself. I mean, Muniz is certainly better, but he's never been submitted. So there's just I think there's a lot of pass for Anders here. He's still getting better in my opinion. Like at times in the UFC, like early on, it was clear that he was like more of just like an athlete. And I think now, over his last couple fights, we've really seen the transition to where now, okay, he's for sure a UFC fighter. And I know it's come against some guys like Darren Stewart looked great against him, but at the same time, it was against Darren Stewart. But still, I think he has advantages in this matchup. And outside of an early submission, I think he gets the job done here. So I played him for 2 units. I like Anders. I think he's the side. What do you guys think?
Yeah, so we got a bet from John, Eric Anders. Luke, any action for you here in this matchup? Same side or any head-to-head on the show this tonight?
No, I'm actually going to agree with Mr. John here. I'm on Anders as well.
Let's go.
which is ironic because I've actually been much higher on Muniz from just a general stylistic perspective in terms of some of his fights. I think he's been extremely undervalued based on those stylistic matchups. I've cashed on Muniz a handful of times, and I have not been a fan of Eric Anders from a betting perspective, but we're bettors. Every single matchup happens in a silo, and we're looking to exploit these numbers here. And why I think Eric Anders is a good value-based play at plus money is that he does stuff takedowns at 78%. I don't think Muniz is the greatest wrestler in the world. John hit on, the guy's obviously a very accomplished submission grappler. The dude went out there and just broke Jacare's arm. I had a decent sized bet on Jacare in that fight, so that sucked. So I have no, bones about the fact that this guy can grapple his ass off and that he is the better submission grappler in this fight. But I don't think he's a great wrestler. And as touched on, I think Eric Anders has the takedown defense to stuff his takedowns. And even in the times we have seen Anders taken down, to your point, he's never been submitted. I think he does a really good job of digging underhooks, getting to a hip, wall walking, cage walking. He does a really good job of that. And despite some of my pacing issues with Anders over the years, Muniz does fucking nothing on the feet at all. So if there's a guy out there who I think that can go out there and actually do more than Andre Muniz and in this type of archetype of a matchup, it's Eric Anders. I think the bigger shots are going to come from him. I think the optics are better from him. I think he actually does have some sneaky knockout upside. Andre Muniz only defends strikes at 45%, which is very, very bad in general, let alone for the higher weight classes to boot. So it's more so, can he stuff the takedowns? Can he kind of avoid the ground like lava? Even if he does get taken down, like I said, I don't think it's just like over and done necessarily, but I am pretty confident to say that if this fight is standing, Eric Anders is going to do more here. So because of that, I think this line should be flipped. I think we should see Eric Anders, kind of around that 55-60% favorite mark. So I was willing to get involved.
Yeah, so it sounds like both of you guys are on Eric Anders. I won't have a bet in this fight, but so I won't take too long here as we've got a couple more fights to go before we even hit the main card. But this is a fight that's sure to tilt me, man, because Luke, you talked about not being a fan of Eric Anders kind of historically in the betting market. I'm the same way. John touched, he was kind of an athlete at the beginning of his career. He's evolved a little bit as a martial artist. I agree with those takes. But at the same time, man, like his win was against his most recent win was against Darren Stewart. He honestly beat him twice, but Darren Stewart no longer with the UFC, lost to Jocko before that, which is, no shame in that loss. It was just kind of a classic loss to Jocko. He's very Eric Anders is very capable of getting outpointed by these guys whose only goal is to outpoint you. We saw that in the Elias Theodoro fight a few years back. Like he's just very content to get out volumed by guys who are low volume and just looking to point fight. But at the same time, like the GM3 win, I saw a comment about that in the chat. I scored that fight for Joe Mearshart, and maybe I'm just a GM3 fanboy. But the way that Mearshart was connecting with Anders on the feet, not that I think that in this particular matchup that Muniz is going to have like a ton of power shots landed. It just Mearshart was landing a bunch of shots on the feet to Anders at distance. I just feel like Eric Anders is a tough guy to trust. I do agree that he's the better athlete in the spot. He's more physical, but not a guy who I'm going to trust to kind of pull off like a super plus EV game plan. Andre Muniz, also someone who I faded with Jacare Souza. Maybe I didn't bet Souza. I at least considered it last time out. I'll have to double check on that. But I was certainly impressed with the fact that he got the submission win here. And that's enough for me to say if he gets Eric Anders to the ground at some point in this fight, I think there's a pretty solid chance that he ends the fight, despite the fact that Anders has never been submitted in his pro career, as John mentioned earlier on. So no bet for me here. I'll likely just be tilting no matter who wins, but I guess I'll root for the Eric Anders side for both of my guys on the show. Let's move on to our next fight here. And this is a fight where I think all three of us kind of have consensus takes. We got Bruno Silva lined as a pretty big favorite, minus 365 here. He's $9.4 thousand on DraftKings. That is the second most expensive fighter on the slate, obviously behind Amanda Nunes at the top. He takes on Jordan Wright. Jordan Wright comes back plus 280 in this matchup. Wright is $6.8 thousand on DK. I mentioned we kind of all have similar thoughts on the fight. Luke, since you're the guest, I'll let you go first here and give out your play on the total here in Silva versus Wright.
Yeah, I like the under 1.5 here at minus 150. Honestly, I'm not a big fan of either fighter. I for sure know that I don't think that Jordan Wright has much longevity in the UFC. I'm still really not sold on that Bruno Silva actually has much longevity in the UFC. So just off the top, when you put those two things together, at least in terms of my general opinion, I love me some general fight-based violence because that always just brings more general variance in terms of how things go. However, from a general stylistic perspective, Bruno Silva is a pretty bad style matchup for Jordan, right? A guy who's consistently struggled with, forward pressure, power-based punchers. I think Silva has over a 90% finish rate in his W's, actually all relating to KOs as well. Jordan Wright, he's going to throw a lot of naked kicks. He's not going to set a lot of stuff up. He's going to keep his hands down. To me, that just brings nightmares for Jordan Wright. However, and why I'm not taking a Bruno Silva inside the distance, Bruno Silva KO approach, and I'm going the under 1.5 instead, is because we have seen Bruno Silva get his back taken, I think, on 4 or 5 different occasions now. We saw him get, generally out wrestled for the large majority of, his last fight against Sanchez. We saw him getting backpacked against Wellington Turman, but Wellington Turman didn't put a body triangle on like a dumbass. Lost a bet there. That really, really sucked.
So did we.
I lost both of those fights that you just mentioned. I lost on both of those. I'm 0 for 2 fading Bruno Silva in the UFC.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the one thing I will say, I will never lay minus 340 on Bruno Silva. But it's the problem with Jordan Wright is he just doesn't possess any offensive wrestling based upside. I think he's actually an okay submission grappler, but if you look at historically, how those subs are coming, it's dropping for leg locks, funky transitions, cage, backpacks. It's not traditional double legs, single legs, pass your guard, mount, arm triangle, rear naked choke. That's traditionally just not how the stuff is coming for Jordan Wright. So that's why I don't have much confidence in him here, but I still can't concede some of the things I've seen from Silva as well. But in terms of a bet, I love the under 1.5 here. I think it's just in archetype for general violence based on how both guys fight. I think Bruno Silva puts him out in the first.
Yeah, John, it seems clear that none of us are massive fans of Bruno Silva over the long term in this matchup, but it seems like this is a spot where he's kind of in a good spot to secure an early finish. I knew you played a variation of the under as well. Talk to us a little bit about your bet here.
Yeah, I think we all kind of agree Bruno Silva probably wins here by a knockout in round 1, but it's juice to the tits. It's like minus whatever, it's unplayable, but at least, the way Luke played it -1 or under 1.5 at -150 is a good look. I played it fight doesn't start round 2. I think you said you played that as well, Jonah, at +140. I played it on FanDuel. I just think that covers, a big majority of outcomes for this fight. Like Bruno Silva probably kills him in round 1, but I'm not sleeping on Jordan Wright's finishing ability either. Like I know he has a lot of issues with his game. Like he doesn't play defense whatsoever. Cardio's a question mark because he just never gets extended in fights. But he does have finishing power. And, he's a guy who, when he does have a little bit of success, like he really tries to get his opponent out of there. So I just think, at any plus money that this fight sees round 2 is probably a bad line because of how often that these guys both finish early. And the concerns that we have on both sides. So I like that quite a bit at +140. I think either guy's capable of finishing. Obviously, I think it comes from the Silva side, but I'll have exposure to both sides on DraftKings, and I'm just hoping for violence like Luke and you as well, Jonah.
Yeah, I was all set to come on the show and brag about that I got a better number than you because PointsBet was hanging at +142 on the fight doesn't start round 2. But then I went to bet it and they rejected my bet and moved the line like 40 cents on air. So that was great. But yeah, I'm on the same thing as you, +140. I believe that's available both at FanDuel Sportsbook, which doesn't have great limits this time in the week for this prop. You could also find it on Fox Bet, which will let you get down a little bit more. So yeah, I'm on the doesn't start round 2 +140, same boat as you guys. I played it for 1.5 units. I think it's a pretty mispriced spot. I do expect violence this weekend. And in terms of DraftKings, I think just one last thing on this fight before we move on. I think Bruno Silva makes for a really strong play. I kind of equate this to the slate UFC 266 when we had Alexander Volkanovski versus Brian Ortega in the main event. And then we saw a similar situation to this week where we had Shevchenko as a massive favorite in the co-main, and everyone is playing Shevchenko, right? She's the biggest favorite, projected to win inside the distance, and she does so against Lauren Murphy. But right below that, we have Matthew Semelsberger, who is also a big favorite. Most of his win, or a lot of his win equity, I should say, comes from a round 1 knockout. And we saw Matthew Semelsberger get that obviously first minute knockout against, I don't even remember the guy who he fought, like Martin Sano Jr., something like that. He won in the first minute. And that was a really good spot to pivot off of like the super heavy owned chalk where Valentina still got there, but at the same time, you were able to pivot. I'm not saying that Bruno Silva necessarily is going to win in the first minute here and kind of get optimal over Muniz. But I do think if you're playing a super chalk lineup, one way to kind of differentiate from the field a little bit is to go down from Muniz, take away a little bit of that massive point projection, but still get a play in Bruno Silva, who I honestly think you can make a good case for should be favored to win the fight in round one. You get that 90 points for the first round bonus, 10 points for a knockdown, all that good stuff. So I do expect Bruno Silva to be a pretty good option on DraftKings this weekend, maybe a little bit contrarian compared to pretty much everyone and their mother who's going to play him in, and Muniz, myself included. Let's move on to the next fight, which is also one that I think makes for a really interesting DraftKings conversation. We got the heavyweights, Tai Chi Ibasa versus Augusto Sakai. Both fighters currently minus 110 a piece, a dead pick 'em. DraftKings prices here a little bit interesting because we've got Tai Chi Ibasa at $8.3 thousand and Augusto Sakai at 7.9, considering the odds are the same. However, this is a fight where I think it's really important to consider, and we'll talk a little bit about this, I assume, in our next fight. It's important to consider the win conditions of each fighter when we talk about DraftKings. Augusto Sakai is someone who, a little bit more of a point-based fighter at heavyweight, does pretty good output on the feet. I think he's a favorite if this fight hits the scorecards. Tai Chi Ibasa, on the other hand, is a knockout artist. I believe all of his wins inside the UFC have come via knockout. He's going to land the big overhand. He's going to do a shoey on his way out of the cage, and he's probably going to put up a close to optimal score on DraftKings if he's able to secure a knockout at $8.3 thousand. I don't have many takes on this fight in terms of the money line. I would have some interest in Augusto Sakai. I actually bet him against Jairzinho Rosenstrike, and I thought that was a spot where Sakai's kind of ability to win minutes and throw volume would be really beneficial for him. And I feel a little bit similarly here against a guy like Tai Chi Ibasa, who's very much KO or bust. But I just didn't like the way that Sakai approached the Rosenstrike fight. And it's not like I think it's recency bias where I'm scared off of playing him because I don't think he's good. I just think that he was really scared of the power coming back at him. And if he's scared of the power in the same way, especially after getting knocked out by Rosenstrike, where he's not going to throw volume in this fight against Tai Chi Ibasa, I think it's really difficult to be confident in playing Augusto Sakai. So early on, I was a little bit interested in taking a plunge on him, but at even money or minus 110 a piece, no action for me here. And I prefer the Tai Chi Ibasa side on DraftKings. I just think his ceiling is super high, especially at $8.3 thousand. He gets that first round knockout. We do have 15 fights, but it seems like he has a pretty solid chance to be in the optimal lineup for somebody come Saturday night. So no action for me in this fight. I'll pick Ibasa in terms of DraftKings potential. And nothing else for me. Luke, anything for you here in the heavyweights?
Yeah, really no strong opinion here at all. But what I will say, I'm kind of, I guess, maybe a little contrarian to the general crowd. It seems like pretty much everybody and their mom is on the over 1.5 here. That's all I've seen all week from even a lot of sharp people too that I respect in the game. It's over. But I think it's interesting, at least when it comes to Sakai, and you look to the fights that have went over for him. I mean, we're looking at Arlovsky and Ivanov, two guys who play, outside-based games. That's not how Tai Chi Ibasa fights in any stretch of the imagination. He's a guy who's going to come forward. He's going to throw a lot of strikes. He's going to force general big exchanges. And I think a little bit of context that's getting lost here as well is both of these guys defend strikes at 50% at heavyweight, which, 50% in general is not great, but especially at heavyweight when you got two big boys chucking heat, despite Sakai, kind of being probably more of your point-based heavyweight, the dude still has a ton of finishes and still has a ton of finishing upside as well. And obviously I think there's some significant finishing upside on the Ibasa side. So I think it's actually a really great fight to target for DraftKings and potentially be different to the general sharp market who thinks the fight's going to go over. I actually think somebody goes out here in the first round, and I actually think it's going to be Ibasa personally. So I think it's a way to just, be a bit different. You're getting two guys also right around that kind of 8K range, so you can fit them both into your construction. So I think one of them actually does find the optimal lineup this week. So I want to have actually heavy exposure to this fight.
Gotcha. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm glad you brought up the line movement. We've seen the over 1.5 rounds kind of steam from the minus 130 range. It actually originally opened like minus 115 at super low limit offshore books, but came up to minus 135 pretty much market wide and has steamed up to the minus 155, minus 160 range. So certainly a lot of money coming in on the over. Contrarian take from Luke there, liking the under a little bit in terms of DraftKings upside. John, anything for you in the heavyweight matchup here before we get to the featured prelims?
No, nothing for me. I mean, I slightly lean Sakai. I think Tai Ibasa certainly has more finishing upside in round one. So to your point, I do prefer him on DraftKings. But outside of that, like I do think Sakai is probably a better fighter over 15 minutes, better pace. He's going to throw more volume. Pretty durable, even though his last couple fights he's got knocked out. But aside from that, he's shown he's able to take a punch. If he stays alive after round one, then I think he wins this at a pretty decent clip here. But I'm kind of rooting for Tai Ibasa. I want to see a shoey, and I think he's the better DraftKings play. So I'll side with you. No action for me, but hope we see a shoey on Saturday.
It's interesting. We actually have, I'm just taking a peek at the money line in the decision only market. We got Tai Ibasa currently priced as a plus 180. So I think the market is kind of in agreement here that Sakai minus 250 over the course of 15 minutes deserves to be a favorite. Should this fight hit the scorecards, John, it sounds like me and you are in agreement on that one. Let's move on to one of the feature prelims here. We got two more prelims before we hit the main card here on UFC 269. And this is a matchup that I think has been drawing a lot of attention kind of throughout fight week. Some of it for comments made that have nothing to do with the fight, but we got Dom Cruz returning to the octagon. He's an even money plus 100 underdog currently against Pedro Munoz, who is small betting favorite. He's minus 120. Both fighters are priced at $8,100 on DraftKings. We've kind of seen this on some of the bigger pay-per-view slates where they'll put two fighters at the same exact price point in the mid-range for the fight that has the closest odds at the time of prices being released. I think that's interesting because you see a lot of, duped lineups that then are split down the middle where half of the lineups with people will have five of the same fighters and then half of them will have, the Pedro Munoz sides. The other half will have the Dominic Cruz side. So I like when DraftKings does that. And it especially makes it interesting if you have a super strong take on the fight in terms of who's going to win. I think you can kind of not necessarily go all in, but you could really leverage kind of the field who might be 50-50 on the fight and kind of go overweight on one side. And John, I know for you, this is a fight that you feel strongly about. I believe you have a 2-unit bet up in the FTN bets tracker this week already. So talk to me about what you're playing here in Pedro Munoz against Dominic Cruz.
Yeah, I like the Pedro Munoz side quite a bit, actually. I think he should be a bigger favorite here. I think he's a much better striker. Dominic Cruz, since he came back, I think it's safe to say he's not at the same level that he once was. And it's not to say that he's completely fallen off a cliff, but watching him in his last two fights, I certainly don't think he's at that level anymore. And Pedro Munoz just has a lot of tools that can give him issues. I think Munoz is a better striker. I think he's got nasty leg kicks. He's going to slow down the movement of Dominic Cruz, and that's where he has a ton of success, constantly moving around the outside, diving in and out of the pocket. I think Munoz is going to slow him down with the leg kicks. If Cruz tries to mix in the wrestling, we know Munoz has that patented guillotine, one of the best in the game. So I just think he has a lot of ways to win here, and he's a super durable guy, never been finished. So it's how does Cruz really win here? Maybe a close striking decision where it's kind of sketchy. He won a split his last fight against Casey Kenny. I think we both cashed on him there. I think I cashed a Cruz decision ticket, but I'm definitely on the other side here. I think Munoz is just kind of better everywhere at this stage in their career. So 2-unit play for me, and I think he's the side on DraftKings as well.
It's interesting, John, you brought up how does Dominic Cruz win this fight, and I'll tell you how I hope he does not win this fight, and that is inside the distance. I have 2 plays on this fight. I played the fight to go to the judges' scorecards at -1. I believe the consensus price I got across the market was 159. I got a -155 at the Superbook, and then I wasn't able to get enough down there, so I took a little bit at -167 on Fox, but I think it came down to, in total, about -160 average price here on the fight to go to decision. Just kind of a play based on the previous results, right? If we look at the past 10 fights from both of these guys, they've been to the judges' scorecards about 75% of the time, which would indicate closer to a -300 betting line. I think we have to lower that a little bit. We consider the fact that Dominic Cruz is coming off of a bunch of injuries, which kind of adds more volatility in terms of getting finished. I don't think he has much upside to finish Pedro Munoz. I actually played last night. I played pretty big play, actually. DraftKings let me get a good amount down on it. I played Pedro Munoz finish only market -150. So if the fight hits the scorecards, my bet is void. I get a refund, obviously. But if someone wins inside the distance, I have a ticket on Munoz at -150. To me, just screams super easy play. Dominic Cruz, we saw him knocked out by Henry Cejudo, which I don't think he took a ton of damage in that fight. But I mentioned, the guy has fought 6 times in what feels like the last decade, tons of injury, a lot of wear and tear on his body. Pedro Munoz has never been finished, is more of an instinctual finisher than Dom Cruz in general, I think. I think it's a close fight, man. I think that John, I give a little bit more credence to the fact that Dom Cruz, credence is actually a Luke word. I think I've heard Luke use that on the Club and Sub podcast, so it's kind of snuck into my own vocabulary after hearing him. But John, I think there's a little bit, I think Cruz has more of a chance to win via wrestling decision than you might be giving him credit for. Just my opinion. I think Cruz is live to hit multiple takedowns in this spot. I'm going to pick Pedro Munoz to win the fight. It just feels like he's the more violent guy at this point in his career, more ability to win the fight kind of in blowout fashion, whereas I think Dom Cruz is probably going to need either split or close unanimous decision in order to win the fight. So hopefully Dominic Cruz doesn't win inside the distance. I think it's like a sub 10% chance that does happen. But if it does, I'll be out like 5.5 units. But yeah, I played Pedro Munoz minus 150 finish only market. I played that for 2.5 units, and then I took a unit of the over. So hopefully the over comes through in my other bet pushes. But yeah, that's what I've got this weekend in Munoz versus Cruz. Certainly a fight which seemingly has two-way action. Luke, anything for you in this fight?
Yeah, I don't want to completely rehash everything because I think John pretty much hit all my main points as well. But what I will say, dude, is I love that that play on Muniz in terms of just finish only. That I think that's probably one of the best plays on this entire card. I think a general Cruz finish is probably about 5%. I'll come at least in terms of how I capped it. But I actually am on the Pedro Munoz side from a money line perspective. Not that I have supreme degree of confidence in him, because actually going in, I thought I'd actually be betting Cruz. But after doing a pretty deep dive into tape, I like Munoz here for a lot of the reasons John mentioned. I think those leg kicks are big. Even going back to that Casey Kenny fight, in the first round, we saw him have a lot of success there. And for whatever reason, the dude just stopped throwing them, which I think was pretty frustrating in general, depending on which side you were on there. But it's not the only fight as well. We've seen Henry Cejudo have some of that same kicking based success. We've seen TJ Dillashaw have some of that same kicking based success as well. Obviously, in a guy in Dominic Cruz whose style is predicated on footwork and movement. And we've seen guys, really get to him when they have been able to get off on those leg kicks. So we know that's something that Pedro is consistent to do. And a big part of this fight too, I think that's being lost a bit is the optics. Pedro, despite a guy who's going to get hit a decent amount, he's going to be the guy going forward, and a guy in Dom who's going to play the outside, which we traditionally know, even if you're effective from the outside, from like a hardcore technical perspective, that doesn't always matter in terms of the eyes of the judges. I'd rather favor in this type of archetype of a fight, the guy's going to be going forward, who's going to be throwing more, who's going to be laying the bigger shots, who I think has that leg kicking based success. I'll slightly disagree with you, Jonah, in terms of the wrestling of Cruz. Obviously, he's a good wrestler, but I mean, Munoz's takedown defense is elite. I think he's got that guillotine to discourage any of those shots from Cruz. And if you actually look at Cruz's general control ratio per takedown, it is very, very, very bad, actually. So I don't see much merit to Cruz landing takedowns. If he does land takedowns, I think it's just not going to be overtly control-based success. He's obviously not going to be submitting a guy like Pedro Munoz. So it's one of those spots where I don't have a supreme degree of confidence in Pedro Munoz at all, but I just don't think the fight should be pick 'em. I think it should kind of be around that 60% mark. So I was willing to get involved. I got 2 units at minus 110 on Mr. Munoz.
Yeah, I think you made a lot of good points there, Luke, specifically about kind of what the judges are seeing. And that's kind of touched on my point a little bit in terms of like the dominant moments in the fight. And I'm not saying that Pedro is going to finish the fight necessarily, but I think the big moments where the crowd is louder, where someone is currently walking the other guy down, I think will belong to Pedro Munoz. I think I only wish that was a factor in the Frankie Edgar fight. I'd have a little bit more money in the bank account if that's how the fight was scored that night, because that was a brutal one, I'll tell you. Right now, we can move on to the final prelim here before we get to the main card of UFC 269. We got an interesting matchup here. We got Josh Emmett returning to action as a minus 155 favorite. He's $9,100. He is the man that might carry the most power in his weight class. I believe he's got like a knockdown in 6 consecutive fights. He's coming off of a dominant win, or not even dominant win, but his power was certainly shown against Shane Burgos in his last fight prior to injury. And then we got Dan Ige, who we saw knock out Gavin Tucker with 1 punch recently, and then obviously lost to Korean Zombie over the course of a 5-round main event in his last fight. But Ige comes back plus 135, 7.4K. Interesting matchup. Seemingly has high stakes here at 145 pounds. not a matchup I thought a ton about this week. If I'm being honest, I find Josh Emmett to be a supremely difficult fighter to cap. It's not that I think his skills are necessarily bad. I think he's a pretty good fighter, but he has this his one trump card, I guess that you would call it, is he has just a ton of power. He has knocked guys down consistently at 145 pounds at a rate that we kind of haven't really seen out of anybody else that I can think of outside of the early Conor McGregor days, that type of power. And it's just one of those things where I have a lot of trouble capping how likely Josh Emmett is to land shots that put Dan Ige's lights out. I think I favor Ige in terms of skill for skill over the course of 15 minutes, but I've never really been a Dan Ige guy. I'm not willing to take a shot at plus 135. I just think that the power threat of Emmett is going to be there pretty much for the entirety of 15 minutes. Kind of rare we see a guy who carries a ton of power throughout the entirety of a fight, but I think that Josh Emmett kind of has that quality to him. So no action for me. I understand Emmett being a small favorite, but I'm not really pushed in either direction to make a play on this fight. John, any action for you here at 145 pounds in our feature prelim of the evening?
No, nothing for me. I agree with a lot of what you said. Emmett's kind of hard to cap because he is one of the most dangerous hitters in this division. But and he's pretty well rounded too. I'll give him credit. But outside of that, I don't know. I kind of think Ige's live here. I didn't bet Dan Ige. I considered it. I do think Ige probably is super live here. I think he could make a competitive, decent boxer, could mix in the wrestling. I know Emmett is a solid wrestler as well, but I have concerns about Josh Emmett. Like you said, fought Shane Burgos basically on one leg, had the ACL surgery, but then had I think 2 follow-up surgeries to that, been off a year and a half. So there are some major concerns here with seeing him as a favorite against somebody that is well-rounded like Dan Ige, BJJ black belt, will mix in the takedown, solid boxer, super durable, never been finished. So I get the underdog stab on Dan Ige, but overall, I just think there's better spots on the card. I also don't think either guy's really going to score a ton on DraftKings. Emmett really needs to win by knockout to score well, and Ige's never been finished. We've seen him take a ton of really, really big punches from other guys in the division. So, no action for me. That's pretty much my take.
Yeah, Luke, anything for you here in our feature prelim?
Yeah, we've kind of agreed on a lot of stuff this week, and I'm actually going to go the other way here. I love Josh Emmett in the spot. I think it's actually a really great spot for him. I got 3 units on him at minus 162. I think the big reasoning for me here is I think there's a massive speed advantage here. I think there's a massive athleticism advantage here, and I think there's a massive defensive edge here. I think where a guy in Dan Ige thrives kind of plays that zombie-based type of pressure. I don't think that is going to really work against a guy like Josh Emmett, especially given the fact that Josh Emmett fought a guy in Shane Burgos who works kind of a similar based style. Granted, that fight was moderately competitive, but the dude also blew his knee out in the first round and still went out there and actually got the better of the striking against a guy in Shane Burgos, a guy whose boxing I value pretty highly. But in general, if you look at the trajectory of Dan Ige's career, I mean, primarily how he's losing, it's early knockouts or it's really close fights. The guy, his defense isn't good, and I think that outside base movement that Josh Emmett brings is going to give a lot of issues to. Oh shit.
No, you're still good. I'm okay. Just featuring you.
We're giving you the full screen effect here.
Okay, you guys scared the shit out of me for a second. I was like, where'd they go? But no, I love Josh Emmett here. As someone who actually bet Dan Ige against Edson Barbosa, that was a fight he did not win, in my opinion. And I think pretty much everybody and their mom will agree with that as well. I think there are just general athletic speed and physical advantages for Josh Emmett. I'm not a guy personally when it comes to betting who is going to play narrative-based games. The guy's coming off the surgery. He's 36. I get it. But he actually took a lot of time off, and actually in interviews he said that, his knee is actually better, at least in terms of the one he blew in comparison to the other one that's healthy. So I think that's something encouraging to note. We've just seen Dan Ige struggle when he cannot consistently get off on his type of game. And I think Josh Emmett is probably one of the most underrated fighters, at least in terms of the betting market in the history of the UFC. The guy's consistently been undervalued at the window. I understand the angle on Ige, and since he's going to come forward, he's going to throw a lot of strikes. But if he comes out here and just volumes up a guy like Josh Emmett, if he goes out there and knocks out a guy like Josh Emmett, I'd be very surprised. And I think there's one other thing that's important to note is despite Dan Igue's black belt status, the dude has consistently dropped minutes and dropped rounds on the mat and has just not looked good on bottom. Emmett's not necessarily a guy who's going to be diving on legs for 15 minutes, but if you're going to tell me, or I should say, if you're going to ask me who's the better wrestler in this fight, it's 100% Josh Emmett. So I think that's another path for him in this fight. I disagree with all of the steam this week, which has been pretty much nothing but one-way action on Dan Ige. I think Mr. Emmett's being a bit disrespected even at minus 155. I think the original line on Emmett around that minus 230 was correct.
It's a good point you make, Luke. I think Emmett has closed like the underdog in 5 consecutive fights. He obviously got like viciously knocked out by Jeremy Stevens at one point in there, but he's like 4-1 over his last 5 and has closed the underdog, I believe, every single time. So to your point, one of the most kind of underrated guys at the betting window historically that we've seen of recent. So don't hate the shot there. As I said, no opinion from me on the fight, but look, if anyone's going to talk me into a play on the podcast, it's going to be Luke, especially if you feel strongly about a 3-unit bet here. So look, you made a good case. I don't know if I'll get there myself, but I definitely understand the points now behind a Josh Emmett play kind of more than I did before we hopped on the show here. Let's move on to the main event, or not a main event. For some people, it's the main event. It is the Sugar Show, but it is the main card. We got Sean O'Malley as a minus 320 favorite here. He's $9.1 thousand on DraftKings against Raulian Paivo's plus 250, 7.1K on DraftKings. And Luke, I know you just you got the full screen treatment for Josh Emmett last time out. No, that was a big play for you. I don't want to throw you right back in the spotlight, but there's a lot of people who they're down on Sean O'Malley, man. They say if he fights a weak strength of schedule, which I think is kind of just factually correct at this point in time. He's not taking super difficult fights. He's kind of been beating up on cans. He fights another guy this weekend, Raulian Paiva, who I don't believe has a number next to his name. He might have at one point, but I don't think he comes into this weekend with a number next to his name. But regardless, probably one of the better opponents, at least on paper, that Sean O'Malley has fought. Minus 300 price tag here for O'Malley. Luke, are you looking to fade him like everybody else seems so excited to do, or you back in the Sugar Show this weekend?
I love the Sugar Show this week, 100%. And that's someone who actually had somewhat moderate upside for Paiva early on. But once again, guys, we're talking about, not necessarily betting fighters, not betting numbers, but betting fighters at numbers. And I just don't see any merit to any sort of dog shot on Paiva here. I got 4 units on O'Malley at minus 280. And it's mainly a stylistic consideration thing for me. Whereas you give me a guy like Paiva against a certain stylistic matchup of somebody who cannot manage distance, who cannot manage range, a guy he can kind of just zombie forward, which has pretty much been the credence to, Paiva's general career. His striking defense sucks. He's just going to take everything guys throws and he's just going to do more. That's how Paiva wins his fights. But he's fighting a guy in Sean O'Malley who can switch stances, fight from both stances, fights from both of them effectively very, very well, who just throws absolute rockets down the pipe. His timing is phenomenal. His speed is phenomenal. I don't think he's like the biggest pure hitter in the world. It's more so like actually kind of a old school Connor thing, I would say, not a guy who's necessarily your biggest pure power puncher, but I think his timing and speed is just on point. So in terms of just general winning minutes from Paiva, I think that general archetype of being the zombie forward pressure based guy is probably the worst style that you can actually fight a guy like Sean O'Malley, if I'm being completely honest. I like O'Malley to put him down relatively early. I think it's important to note that, Paiva's fought the large majority of his career at 125, where he's had physical advantages, made his debut up at 135 against Kyler Phillips, where, necessarily those physical advantages didn't come into play despite him not being knocked out. He got hurt at multiple points in that fight. And I would say that Sean O'Malley, maybe you guys will disagree with me on this, but Sean O'Malley's pretty clearly a much bigger hitter than Kyler Phillips, at least in terms of pure power punching. You can talk about kicks, Kyler Phillips, I understand that. But in terms of pure power punching, I think it's O'Malley all day. I've heard some people talk about, the wrestling and the grappling, but I mean, how many people has Paiva, taken down, just grinded out, submitted, outside of the general shitty Brazilian regional scene. He hasn't really done that to many guys. Really the last time that's happened to Sean extensively, was pretty early on against Tyrion Ware, and he blew his knee in that fight as well. The dude's a brown belt under Tanquinho Mendes, who's fucking super high level, if I'm being completely honest. So I don't see much merit to this Paiva grappling narrative either. I think O'Malley's probably 80-85% in this spot. I think there is a spot to fade O'Malley 100% going forward when he kind of starts swimming with the deeper sharks. This is not it, in my opinion. I think it's an excellent spot for Sean O'Malley. I think he's a great spot on DraftKings. I think he's a great spot on FanDuel. I think he's a great spot on Super Draft. I love O'Malley.
Yeah, I'll go next here. I haven't actually laid it with Sean O'Malley. First of all, Luke, I really enjoyed that breakdown. A couple interesting things. I thought the Kyler Phillips point about his physicality kind of giving Raulian Paiva some issues. We know that Sean O'Malley and Kyler Phillips are teammates. Rumor has it that Kyler Phillips might have has put him down before. Those who know. But in terms of this matchup and how he matches up, Sean O'Malley matches up with Raulian Paiva, I think he's the way bigger guy, much more technical striker. And it's interesting, Luke, you said, I think the prototype worst suited to face a Sean O'Malley is the zombie who walks forward. But people are telling me that he looked up at the clock once or twice against Chris Moutinho, only landed 230 strikes in that fight. So maybe it wasn't as dominant an effort as everybody else wants it to be. But in my opinion, man, I just think that Sean O'Malley is such a higher level fighter than Raulian Paiva. I thought that Paiva had some upside at 125 when he debuted. He was big for the weight class, just a solid guy in general, it seemed like. But he's absorbed more strikes than he's landed throughout his UFC career. He's a shitty wrestler who doesn't attempt many takedowns. And I think that Sean O'Malley is just kind of going to play with him at distance. I don't really see this being a competitive fight whatsoever. I don't like laying prices like minus 300 in pure kickboxing fights. I just think that there's a lot of variance. But at 135 pounds, where we're really fighting against a 125er who hasn't shown a ton of power, I think that there's kind of a low chance that we get like the fluke knockout from Raulian Paiva in this spot. In hindsight, it was kind of dumb of me to wait on O'Malley because, like, obviously the kid's a big star. He's going to take money through fight week. I probably should have gotten involved as early as I could have. But look, I think minus 300 is probably value on Sean O'Malley. I haven't pulled the trigger, but I do think that it makes sense to kind of have him in the 80 to 85% range. 75% is where the line currently stands at minus 300. So, yeah, I'm interested in Sean O'Malley. If he was to take on a guy like a Ricky Simone, maybe even a Cody Stamen, I think that those are matchups that would give him trouble. But honestly, if you look at the UFC bantamweight rankings, I was arguing with some people earlier today. Oh, yeah, Ricky Simone, that good comment there in the chat. I think that's a solid spot to fade him. But again, if you look at the bantamweight rankings, I don't think there's anybody outside of the top six that I would pick to beat Sean O'Malley. Like, I think he's literally better than everybody ranked 7 to 15 right now. So if you guys are listening, you can pull up the rankings. I just think that this kid's really talented. And I know he's got the rainbow hair and all that stuff. He's a big character. I understand that he's a hateable character for some, but in terms of just pure fighting skill, when he's fighting these lower level opponents, I just think that he's such a higher level guy. So I'll pick Sean O'Malley here, minus 300. I think it's worth the bet. Maybe 3 units to win one. John, I know you're not a guy to lay chalk often, but is this a spot? I'm sure you're not that interested in it. Any props for you in this matchup, or do you maybe even like the underdog and provide some resistance for Luke and I fanboying over Sean O'Malley here?
No, man, I'm on the sugar show as well. Like no bet for me. Like you said, I'm not a big chalk guy at that number, but definitely no interest in Raulian Paiva. I liked him a lot more at 125. Now moving up, like, even though he could never make 125, so now he's moving up to 135. He's actually going to be smaller here. Like, I think O'Malley has a reach advantage here, a couple inches there. I think he's going to be more powerful, much better technical striker. I think there's no arguing that. And like you said, I think the cardio issues, yes, it's still a concern, but I also think it's overblown. Like you said, literally, like, yes, he was gassing in that Matino fight, but that was because he threw everything in the kitchen sink at the kid and he just kept moving forward. Like, it was insane. And
I don't even think he has bad cardio. Not to cut you off, sorry, John, but like, well, honestly, I don't get those takes at all. Like, he landed 230 strikes on the kid.
I think why is because we saw in that Matino fight, like, I think it was towards the end of the second round, especially in the third, like, you saw him step back and go and look up at the clock. So, like, people see that and they're like, oh, he's gassed. You know what I mean? But like you said, like, it's because he literally threw like 300 strikes. Like, I don't know, man. But yeah, I mean, I like Sean O'Malley here. I think he's the much better fighter. I think he probably wins by knockout here. And honestly, that Matina fight should have been stopped. Like he was wearing the Suns jersey coming out, did the basketball dribble. Like, you know what I mean? Like he was going for the highlight reel knockout. I forget who was the ref, but we've had some egregious refereeing lately. And that was another one that I thought could have been stopped in round 1.
The ref was exactly who you thought it, who you think it would be.
Herb Dean.
Yeah,
Jesus Christ, man! Every single time. Oh God! But yeah, I mean, I'm not gonna go on too long here. We've been going for a minute, but yeah, I like the O'Malley side. I agree with you guys. I think he's a strong play this week.
And real quick, John, I think it is important to note from the whole slowdown narrative. The dude set a strike record not only in 1 but 2 rounds in that fight in the division in UFC history. So it's like, I mean, people giving the dude shit about, him potentially, sucking a bit of wind. It's like the dude set a strike record on this dude's face and not in 1 but 2 rounds. I think there's some context lost there.
Yeah, for sure. Like 83 strikes while he's gassed around 3. Whatever. We'll stop fanboying over him. If he loses, it'll be funny. Someone's got to clip this if he ends up losing this weekend. But I think there's a time and place to fade Sean O'Malley. It is not this weekend. Let's move on. Second fight on the main card. We got Cody Garbrandt making his flyweight debut. He's currently a small favorite at -135. He's $8,700 this weekend against Kai Kara France, who comes back +115 as the dog. 7.5K for Kai Kara France, who's coming off of a knockout in a comeback fashion, honestly, against Bontorin. Excuse me, where he kind of fell into a grappling realm early on. The fight seemed to be in some trouble, got up, highlight reel, walk-off KO in that matchup. And honestly, I think that Kai Kara France is pretty live for Cody against Cody Garbrandt this weekend. I'm long on the record in saying that I don't think Cody Garbrandt was really ever that great of a fighter. I still don't think he's that great of a fighter. In fact, my opinion of him is obviously lessened, as I'm sure most everybody's has. He's lost 4 of his last 5 fights. But in general, you just look back at this guy's career, carried a lot of power for sure at 135 pounds. I'm sure that will translate to 125 when he's fighting smaller guys. But to me, Cody Garbrandt is someone who his best performance, for sure the best performance of his career, comes against Dominic Cruz. And a fight that I think was honestly not as big a blowout as it was meant to look. Like, I think a lot of people remember that as like one of the biggest one-sided ass whoopings in UFC history. It was certainly not like that when you go back and rewatch the fight, but certainly like a showman. Like, Cody Garbrandt was a brand. People got behind it for sure. But at this point in his career, man, like, he gets outlanded by a ton of guys he faces. He's honestly not that high volume outside of those times when he really goes rabies on his opponent. We've seen him, the Pedro Munoz fight obviously comes to mind, where he gets hit and then just decides to bite on the mouthpiece, get into a brawl. But like, even the Rafael Assunção fight, which he won via walk-off KO earlier this year at the end of round 2, he landed less than 20 strikes in that fight. You know what I mean? Like, he was landing 10 strikes around, not super high volume, does not look to offensively wrestle much. He's a decent defensive wrestler. Like, I don't think that Kai Kara France is going to go out there and put him on his butt multiple times. But look, Kai Kara France hits relatively hard for 125 pounds. I think he's got knockdowns in like 4 of his 7 fights in the UFC. We've seen him get the knockout, obviously, last time. And then against Brandon Royval, he sat Brandon Royval down. Like, I'm not a massive Kai Kara France fan, and I haven't bet him yet just because I've kind of struggled in these spots with small underdogs, where I kind of view the fight as a coin flip, and I'm taking a shot at like +120, +125. Throughout the year, I've kind of struggled with those spots a little bit, but I do think that you can make a decent case for Kai Kara France to be the favorite in this spot. Probably the more durable guy. I don't think there's a huge power advantage for Cody Garbrandt, and I expect the Kai Kara France to kind of land a little bit more volume, I should say, throughout the entirety of the fight. So it's an interesting matchup. Cody Garbrandt obviously going weight class after struggling with his durability, I think would make for a little bit of pause in anyone's take here, but I'm kind of curious what you guys think about it. John, I'll let you go first. Any action for you on either the Garbrandt or Kai Kara France side this weekend?
No action for me as of now, but I'm finally on the other side. We finally are not agreeing on something here. I like the Cody Garbrandt side. I think he, pending the weigh-ins, everything goes smoothly tomorrow, dropping down to 125. Like, I do think he's clearly the better striker than Kai Kara France. Kara France has been someone that I've always been fading. I think he's been overrated by the market a lot, and I think we're seeing it again here. Like, I don't understand it, man. Like, aside from his output being more than Garbrandt, and Garbrandt, at times letting his opponents kind of dictate the fight and just getting outpointed. Like, aside from that, I think Cody's probably got him covered here. Like, Cody's a better wrestler. I don't know if he'll go to it, but he's a better wrestler. I think he's a better striker. I think he can mix in the leg kicks. I think he's a more powerful striker. Kai Kara-France, I know he had the knockout against Boncharin, but outside of that, he hasn't really finished anybody aside from the regional scene. I don't know. I think pending the weigh-ins, I like the Garbrandt side here. But I'm not like super convicted in it, but I do think he's the side. Maybe if it closes a little bit more, then I'll end up getting a bet here on the Garbrandt side. So we'll have to ask Luke to split the tie here on the Garbrandt Kara-France matchup.
Yeah, go for it, Luke.
Yeah, no strong opinion here for me. So I don't want to say, yeah, here
pick a side.
Get this clown off the podcast. No, I'm actually more on the Garbrandt side in the sense that I think there are still a lot of questions actually to be answered on the France side as much as there are on the Garbrandt side. Obviously, the weigh-in, how he comes in and looks at 125 pounds needs to 100% be noted. But I also think it's very interesting to note that, who's Kai's best win? Fucking Paiva? Maybe? Or whatever, where Cody's been fighting, elite level competition. Yeah, if he's going to sit there and bite the mouthpiece, fight like an idiot, that's, throwing shit up in the window. But I think against a guy in Kai Kara-France, who I don't overtly value, to be honest, I think he's always been relatively overrated by the general market. I don't think his overall skill set is very good. To John's point too, I think from a wrestling perspective, he's obviously very good. I think he has a path there, not assuming that he's probably going to take it, but nonetheless, I think it's a path. And I think kind of a misnomer here in this fight, as much as people want to talk about Cody's chin, it's very, very meritable, 100%. But I think a lot of people also lose the context that, Kai Kara-France has been dropped, in multiple fights in the UFC. The guy's not 100% a defensive striking savant either. So I think Cody's going to be the bigger guy. I think he can do more here. And it's more of actually a show me spot for Kara-France in a lot of ways too, to see how he can deal with that, because he's also fought a lot of guys in terms of his W's who are also no longer in the UFC. Which needs to be noted, where Cody's been fighting elite level competition. So it's one of those spots where I don't really want to get involved in, just because I feel like I'm playing into a ton of variance, but I do think Cody's the side. I really do.
Yeah, I kind of think when we have a lot of variance in these spots, sometimes I like to look to the under. Maybe I haven't thought about the total enough in this fight. I appreciate that both of you guys brought up the weigh-ins. I'm not somebody who typically waits to see the weigh-ins. I know there's some people who make like really big decisions based off of how fighters look on the scale. I tend to think a lot of that is overblown, just my personal stance. But this is certainly a spot where we have a guy who historically has not been that durable at 135 pounds, moving down to 125. We saw a similar situation with TJ Dillashaw, where he looked really bad on the scales, and then obviously went out against Henry Cejudo in the first round. I'm not saying that this is necessarily a situation where if Cody looks like he had a tough weight cut, he's obviously going out early in the fight. I'm just saying that's certainly something to keep in consideration. So tomorrow morning, obviously, are the weigh-ins on Friday morning. If you guys are listening to this, obviously Friday morning are the weigh-ins. So yeah, something to keep an eye on for sure. Glad that both of you brought that up. Let's move on to the featured bout on the main card here. We got Santiago Ponzinibio taking a little bit of money throughout fight week, has moved to a small betting favorite here at minus 130. He's $8.2 thousand against Jeff Neal, who comes back plus 110. Jeff Neal is $8,000 flat on DK. Jeff Neal is coming off of 2 consecutive losses. Also a situation outside of the octagon where he was arrested a few weeks ago. Seems to be a lot of unknowns coming into this fight. Even on the Santiago Ponzinibio side, this was a guy who was out for a long time with injuries, came back, pretty much got murked by Li Jingliang in his first fight, and then went through a lot of adversity in the Miguel Baeza fight. Came back and won in what was impressive fashion at the time, but kind of a performance that I feel personally has not aged great after seeing Miguel Baeza take on Chaos Williams. It kind of feels like a prime Santiago Ponzinibio would have dominated that fighter as opposed to have to come back later on in the fight. So look, I'll be honest, I haven't thought a ton about this matchup this week. No action for me. I think it's tough to kind of make a read on Jeff Neal, someone who I certainly thought was overrated by the market. I bet on Stephen Thompson against him. I thought that was a really solid spot, but it's tough to have much confidence in either guy here. Jeff Neal coming off back-to-back losses, seems to be some like out of the octagon issues going on. And then Ponzinibio injured, comes back and hasn't looked great since the injury. Just a tough spot to trust either guy. See the total at 1.5. Little bit slight lean to the over, but nothing where I feel super strongly about making a play, at least yet. Maybe one of you two can talk me into it. Luke, I'll let you go first here. Featured bout of the night, Ponzinibio versus Neal.
Yeah, so no super strong take for me, but I did actually play Ponzinibio at Pick'em here. My big reasoning is obviously outside of, Homeboy not looking great in his last two. We have seen Santiago Ponzinibio fight very, very similar archetypes to Jeff Neal, or at least somewhat parallels over a large trajectory. A Sean Strickland, a Zach Cummings, a Nordine Taleb, Neil Magny, Miguel Baeza. He's fought some pretty solid mid-range based kickboxing archetype type of guys, and he's beat them all. And I think he can do the same thing exactly here. And I'm not a Jeff Neal hater by any means, because I do think he has some technical components of his game. He's got, a really good straight left. He's got a really good high kick, which does make me a little bit nervous in this fight, because Pons will leave his hands down at times. He has shown some hittable components, but it doesn't change the fact that I think that Jeff Neal has struggled with effective pressure in certain fights, and I think that a guy in Santiago Ponzinibio can kind of disrupt that general game that Jeff Neal needs to succeed, because Jeff Neal kind of needs to be in that type of rhythm where he's having his biggest amount of success outside of him, like obviously knocking somebody out early or something like that, but extended. He really needs to get into that type of rhythm. And a guy in Ponzinibio is a guy who's going to throw a lot of strikes. I think he's probably got one of the best jabs actually at 170 pounds. He's got a good straight right. He's got a good low leg kick. They obviously have a mutual opponent in Neil Magny. Don't really like to play this game, but I think it's still somewhat important to note. He beat the shit out of Neil Magny. Didn't really look too good for Mr. Neal when he fought Magny as well. So I think he's got advantages on the feet here. A lot of people also forget that he is a black belt in jiu-jitsu as well. So I think that is a, ever so slight path. It's not something I'm banking on because the guy doesn't wrestle a lot, but it's another one of those spots kind of similar to Pedro Munoz, not from like a stylistic perspective, but a fight in which I think, where it's at Pick'em, probably should be about minus 150 Pons. A lot of people also forget that the dude was probably about, maybe a fight or two away from a title shot pre-injury. I think a lot of people have forgot about the guy. He's still an extremely talented fighter. He's beat some of the best guys out there. I like Pons at evens.
Yeah, so maybe we'll get some disagreement. You guys just disagreed with me on the last fight. John, we'll go to you here. Any take for you on Jeff Neal? Sounds like Luke has a bet on Pons here at around evens. Anything for you in this matchup?
Yeah, I was close to playing Jeff Neal. So yeah, a little bit of disagreement there. I didn't really like what I saw from Pons since returning from the long layoff. Obviously, he had the health scare. Did not look good whatsoever. The Li Jinglang fight, got knocked out, but really just looked like, kind of lost in there. And then, yeah, he rebounded nicely. It was good to see him get that win rebound against Miguel Baeza, who's a hot prospect, but now that win is kind of aging poorly. Baeza is somebody that doesn't play a lot of defense, similar to Pons, like keeps his hands low, super hittable. I think that could be a problem against a good boxer like Jeff Neal. Jeff Neal is a technical striker, does have power. I kind of like the Neal side. Like, there's another one where I'm like leaning towards the underdog, but I'm not like at plus 110. Like, I'm not like I didn't bet it. You know what I mean? So it's not like I'm like super into him, but I do think he's my preferred side here. Just because I think he's a better boxer, but there are some concerns on the Neal side. Like, obviously he was in the headlines recently, like Jonah mentioned about the DUI or whatever. And I know he came out and said like it wasn't a big deal. The headline made it sound worse than it needed to be or whatever, but it's still kind of concerning. And then obviously didn't look great in his last two fights, but I think I kind of chalked those up to just tough matchup for Neal. And I think this one's much better against an aging Ponzinibio that has kind of looked like a shell of himself since returning. So I like the underdog here, but not enough to probably place a bet unless we see some line movement in the Ponzinibio favor.
Yep, let's move on here to the co-main event of the night. It's something I always like to point out in terms of these DK slates. We got 2 5-round fights. Obviously, the first one from the women's bantamweight title between Amanda Nunes and Juliana Pena, and then we will, of course, get to the lightweight title fight between Dustin Poirier versus Charles Oliveira. Let's start first here in the co-main. We got Amanda Nunes in her typical spot, about a minus 1,000 favorite where we're typically seeing her these days. She's $9,500, obviously the most expensive fighter on DraftKings. She takes on Juliana Pena. Pena, least expensive fighter on DK at $6,500, plus 650 for Juliana Pena. And look, we've done 13 fights. We've got one more to go after this. We don't need to take too long on this fight if there aren't any strong takes. I think the general consensus here is that Amanda Nunes is just kind of not a matter of if, it's more of a matter of when. And for me, I actually took a shot. I have a bet on this fight, and I played Amanda by decision at plus 500. I played a little bit of unanimous decision at plus 600. It's not a play that I expect to win. You know, sometimes in betting, when we look at the odds at a plus 500, it's something that I don't expect to win, but I do think there's value in the odds at plus 500 in this spot. Amanda Nunes historically is somebody who is very much a first round finish or decision type of fighter. Like, a lot of her finish equity is tied to an early finish in a fight. And I think that's certainly live here in a fighter in Juliana Pena, who we've seen, she got rocked by, I wouldn't say rocked, but certainly ate some big shots from Sarah McMahon. We saw her submitted by GDR. Like, I don't think that Juliana Pena is like the most durable fighter in the world. I think she's tough. I don't think she's a great defensive grappler. In this matchup, and I worry a little bit that she's going to like actually bring the fight to Nunes, as opposed to like if Nunes doesn't want to bring the fight the way she did in the Felicia Spencer fight, then she's kind of, Pena would be happy to lay back. But look, like Nunes is 8 title fights in a row. 3 of them have gone the distance, granted against probably better competition than somebody in like Juliana Pena. But if someone is looking at the odds here, it doesn't make sense to me that the over 1.5 rounds is minus 140, and then Amanda by decision is plus 500. You look at like almost all of her finishes in the last decade outside of the Pennington fight, which was kind of like injury related, I would say, down the stretch. And that's obviously credit to Nunes for finishing the fight, putting damage on Pennington throughout the fight. But historically, all of Nunes's finishes have come in round 1, literally all of them except for the Pennington fight. And so she's unable to get the finish in round 1 here against Juliana Pena. I kind of think that this fight has a decent chance to hit the scorecard. So plus 500, I'm fine taking a shot. I played a little bit of unanimous to plus 600 as well. Just trying to get around limits a little bit at a Fox bet. So bet for me in the co-main event. Boys, if you have anything you want to add here, any groundbreaking takes for the Amanda Nunes fight versus Juliana Pena, feel free to do so. Luke, I'll let you go first here in the co-main.
Yeah, nothing crazy for me. I just don't like how Juliana Pena defense strikes. I think she kind of just bulls her way in, and even in some of the fights, that she's won, kind of even gotten her to this title shot, she's pretty much dropped, the first round, the first half of her fights via grappling, and a lot of them, most notably the Katzengano fight. She did it against Sarah McMahon, a couple other girls as well. So, you got Nunes sitting at, I think, about like 40% implied to ice this girl in the first. I think it's a very, very live outcome, just as much as everyone does. I understand that there's kind of this Pena tough narrative. I get it 100%, but I think she gets smoked. I think she gets smoked under 1.5. Obviously that's not, Mark take or whatever. It seems like that's probably the consensus. And I get some of the toughness narrative from Pena, but I just don't see it. I don't like how she goes distance. I think she even got moderately dropped by GDR early in that fight as well. I think Nunes puts her down personally.
John, anything for you here in the Nunes versus Pena fight?
Yeah, I'm not going to beat a dead horse here. I think Nunes absolutely rolls. I think pretty much everybody thinks that. I just don't think Pena has anything for her. She's more of a fighter that has success with the wrestling, and I don't even think she can really take Nunes down here. And if she does, I think Nunes is a much better grappler. I think she's liable to submit her. So I think Nunes is one of the safest floor and ceiling plays on DraftKings this week. So yeah, I think she gets another defense here, and then maybe we see her against Kayla Harrison in the future.
Yeah, or maybe she just retires and we can stop watching her as the main event or co-main event on every pay-per-view, because if you ask me, there's like 20 better fights on this card than our co-main event. But yeah, I think we're all picking him at Nunes. Sounds like you guys, I don't even want to say you guys because I expect it to be pretty one-sided as well. I just think there's a little bit of value of plus 500 on that Nunes decision, but certainly not a bet I'm going to be shocked to lose in the first, 20, 30 seconds of the fight. Let's move on to the reason we are all here. The reason the fight that this card was built around. We got Dustin Poirier minus 155 here as the title challenger. He's $8.6 thousand on DraftKings against Charles Oliveira, who will look to defend his lightweight belt for the first time. He's a plus 135 dog here, $7.6 thousand on DraftKings. A little bit of line movement throughout the week. The Dustin Poirier number has dipped into kind of the minus 150 range in some spots offshore. Luke, I saw you put out one of your famous tweets earlier today, being a little bit, it seemed like you were maybe a little bit interested in the Dustin Poirier side, close to minus 150 at current market. Talk to us about if you have any play or what you're targeting here in the main event between Oliveira and Poirier.
Yeah, I actually did put out a free bet, I think, a couple days ago on the alt total on the under 3.5. I think at about minus 205. I think that's taken a bit of steam. I think it's around to like minus 230 or so. Obviously, I put out the gif of Mr. Poirier around minus 150. I do think he's the side, but I guess just touching on kind of the alt total and why I think that has a ton of value and why I wouldn't get too cute with the 1.5 or the 2.5. Traditionally, all these guys' fights, are ending pretty early. At least I should say in terms of Oliveira. And the style dynamic here, I think, is very, very interesting. And why I still have some hesitations in terms of pulling the trigger on Poirier, because obviously there's a ton of more merit to him as this fight goes long. I still think there's a ton of merit to him early because I do think he's the better striker. I think he's the better boxer. I do think Charles Oliveira still does have some quit in him, but you cannot disregard the fact that Charles Oliveira is the best submission artist in the history of the UFC, who's also improved his boxing quite a bit. Poirier is hittable. Poirier has been hurt before. So I think there's some definite merit to that. So it's one of those spots where I'd rather look to back general based fight violence in terms of a general side. But I do have this like slight, issue of what's been going on with all of these main events that are projected based on stylistics, even based on the odds that are projected not to go to the distance, and they just continue to do it. So I really hope this is not the case where it's one of those ones that, everybody and their mom, this is going to finish, this is going to finish, this is going to finish, and it doesn't. But I really like that 3.5 number because I think it gives you a bit more of a buffer. I think, obviously the Oliveira side is very entrenched early. Dustin more so late if the fight does go late, but I still have massive questions on Charles Oliveira's striking defense because so many of his fights have ended so early. We know Dustin's a guy who's going to come forward. He's going to put it on guys and has no quit in him. But on the other side of the coin, and why I still have some hesitation on Dustin, is that if you really go back and look at it, we have not seen Dustin face a lot of overtly good grapplers. Obviously, Khabib and a couple other guys in there, some Jim Millers back in the day, the Pettis, but still, like over a large sample size, we haven't seen Dustin face, a really high level grappler, at least consistently. And we have seen some notions of Dustin to give his back. We've seen some notions for Dustin jump guillotines. I said that on the Club and Sub Pies. I was like, what are the odds that Dustin jumps guillotine on Charles Oliveira? I was like, people will lose their goddamn minds.
Didn't Chandler jump guillotine against Oliveira earlier this year? And like Chandler jumped it against Oliveira. I was shocked at that. And like Dustin historically has done it in like a multitude of fights.
I know I just thought it was funny to say, like, what are the chances that he jumps guillotine on Oliveira? But I do think Dustin is the better fighter here, despite his takedown defense largely being pretty good, despite his submission defense largely being pretty good. I still have some issues there 100%, but I still think from a handicapping perspective, despite me thinking the under 3.5 is a great play because both guys have significant finishing upside, the longer this fight goes, it significantly favors Dustin Poirier, in my opinion. So I do think he is the side at minus 150, but I don't know if I can 100% get there because of some of those general grappling questions. And I don't know if I can lay favorite money against Charles Oliveira, but I do think Mr. Poirier is the side.
Yeah, I think that's a super solid breakdown on the main event. I'll go second here. I actually played something similar to you, Luke. I actually missed that you gave out that bet on Twitter at SWR_betting, that free bet in the under 3.5 alternate total. I played something similar here. I played it about 2 weeks ago. I played the fight does not start round 4, so essentially under 3 rounds. I got that at minus 152. It certainly steamed a good amount since then. I think I got it in pretty good number. I got 2.5 units down on it. So a near max bet for me here on the under. And I think Luke gave pretty great reasons why. You know, we've seen Dustin Poirier in a lot of stylistic fights. One that we haven't seen a ton of him is against really solid grapplers. And this is a guy who was taken down by Dan Hooker and controlled a little bit. And it's not like Dustin Poirier is a bad wrestler or really a bad grappler, but he does have some tendencies pulling guillotine. You know, I think he's aware enough of that kind of that issue in his game at this point. Like, he's put out tweets about it in the past, like making fun of himself for doing it. I think he knows, like, he's a smart enough guy to not do that against Charles Oliveira, but we've also seen him give his back to get up oftentimes. Like, Charles Oliveira, this is not a guy who, if he gets your back when you're dry, many people survive. Actually, shout out to Michael Chandler, who survived that. I haven't historically been a big Mike Chandler fan, but going into that fight, I kind of thought that if Oliveira was able to get in a dominant position early in the fight, he would win pretty easily by submission, and he was unable to do so. Kind of touching more on that Chandler fight, you know, the reason why I picked Oliveira in that fight, I was pretty confident in that side with the under there as well, is that I was pretty convinced that Oliveira was actually like a significantly better technical striker than Michael Chandler. You know, I knew that Chandler had the power, but I think that Oliveira's technical striking in terms of his Muay Thai, his knees, his elbows, kind of his basic leg kicks as well, it's basic combinations that he just consistently throws. I feel like those have gotten way better throughout his UFC career. And everyone talks about the narrative of, oh, Charles Oliveira used to be this guy who quit on himself mid-fight, and he still, you know, has those tendencies. We see it where he gets in bad spots. He doesn't want to be there anymore. And I understand that narrative, how he's kind of come from being this guy who's fought for all these years and now is reaching the top of the sport, reaching the pinnacle of a world title. But at the same time, I actually think that he's made a lot of improvements as a fighter kind of outside of the narrative. Like, I think his striking has just gotten way better. And that's not to say that I think he'll outbox Dustin Poirier, because I think Dustin Poirier is actually one of the best boxers in the UFC. He's somebody whose striking has come a long way. He was always predominantly a striker, but his boxing has gotten way more crisp than he's obviously been around a long time. You go back and watch some of those early Dustin Poirier fights. I think he's improved a lot in the striking. I think that Poirier has an advantage in the boxing. I'm not sure it's going to be like a complete blowout on the feet, at least for the first 10 minutes or so. Luke, you made some points about Dustin Poirier having advantages down the stretch of this fight, which I agree with. And it's not necessarily the fact that I think that Charles Oliveira has a bad gas tank or someone who like isn't going to be able to fight past 10 or 15 minutes. It's just against pretty much anyone in this division. Dustin Poirier is a guy who gets stronger as fights goes on. He's someone who has the kind of the rare ability where he can look tired and is still able to put out a ton of output, still able to catch a second win. The Dan Hooker fight comes to mind. Like, Dustin Poirier, I don't want to say he was out on his feet, but ate a ton of damage in that spot. Seemed like he was slowing down, went back to the corner, kind of reset. I think he's a guy who's just super durable, tough to put away. But I wouldn't count Charles Oliveira out in the striking here. I'll give Poirier an advantage in the striking. Oliveira, obviously, an advantage in the grappling. I'll pick Dustin Poirier. I understand him being a small favorite. Just think he's a little bit more of a well-rounded fighter with durability and cardio advantages in this fight. But I kind of feel like people continue to underestimate Charles Oliveira. I wouldn't be shocked here if he won. I think at this current odds, I would only bet Charles Oliveira on the money line if I were to make a play. Unlikely to, you know, at plus 150, I think there starts to be like legitimate value personally on the Charles Oliveira side, but I do kind of think that the under and Oliveira money line are a little bit correlated, where I think there's more of a chance that I could lose both my under and money line bet if Poirier puts him away in rounds 4 and 5, as opposed to, I don't think there's a great chance that like Oliveira is going to, money line will cash, but my under is going to lose, if that makes sense. So no action for me on the money line. I doubt I get involved unless some serious steam comes in, but I'll pick Dustin. I think it's a super close fight, not quite a coin flip, but certainly competitive. My biggest bet here is does not start round 4, minus 152 for 2.5 units. I think that's good, kind of all the way up to minus 230. So still a little bit of value there if you have not gotten it in yet. That's my main event breakdown. John, we have we've gone 14.5 fights. We got one breakdown left. Give the people what they're all here to see, my man. Your main event breakdown for Oliveira versus Poirier.
Yeah, I don't really have a ton to add. I thought both of you guys broke it down really well here. I do prefer the Poirier side, but it's not like, you know, a super convicted lean or whatever. Like, I understand the danger that Charles Oliveira presents. Like you guys hit on it, one of the most dangerous grapplers in the division, if not the most dangerous. And he's also a solid wrestler as well. And we've seen Dustin get out wrestled multiple times. A few of those fights come to mind. The Khabib fight, you mentioned the Dan Hooker fight. That one was a little bit more concerning because Hooker's not really known as a wrestler. So obviously there are paths for Oliveira here as a live underdog, but I do just favor the striking of Dustin Poirier. I think he can keep the fight standing for the most part. And then over the course of 25 minutes, I think he has better cardio, better durability. And like I said, I think his striking edge is pretty significant here. So I like the Poirier side, no bet for me. But in terms of DraftKings, I'm going to have both sides with a small to moderate lean towards the Dustin Poirier side. But yeah, that's it. 15 fights. So I know we went a little bit long, guys. Appreciate all the support as always. Thank you to Luke. Shout out to him at SWR_betting on Twitter. Be sure to give him a follow. And if for whatever reason you didn't smash that like button and subscribe already, then do that right now. But that's it, guys. Appreciate you joining us. I'm John Kelly. That's SWR Betting and at JShiffyDFS. This is the Undisputed MMA Show presented by the FTN Network, saying goodbye and good luck, and we will see you guys next time.